So we're going to be talking a little bit about the organization that I work for. We're also going to be talking about what mental health is. We're also going to talk about, do elderly and the seniors actually develop mental illness, or is it just for young people? And what are the challenges and how does stress affect us? Because that's a really important component. And then tips for supporting ourselves and those we care about. All right, so I work for the Schizophrenia Society of Ontario. I am the regional and educational lead. So my territory is southwestern Ontario. But my office is here in Hamilton. It's just on James Street South, right around the corner from St. Joe's. Our office has actually been there for over 20 years, and I've been there for almost 8 now. And we used to be known as the Friends of the Schizophrenics. Back in 1978, I do believe that Bill Jeffries in Oakville created the Friends of the Schizophrenics because he had a son and a brother and 2 brothers who had schizophrenia. And they found that there was resources for the individual who was ill, but not for families. So they started the organization. And since back then it was a very grassroots organization where family members supported each other who had a loved one who had schizophrenia. We still do that today. A lot of the work that we do is supporting families and having families support one another. But it's not just with schizophrenia. It's schizophrenia and psychotic illnesses, and actually all mental illnesses. So we have support groups once a month. We actually run educational programs. And a lot of the work that I do is in the schools and in the community. So I am a mental health first aid instructor with the Mental Health Commission of Canada. So what that means is I go out and I teach mental health first aid. So who here has ever taken CPR or regular first aid? Okay. So mental health first aid is a 2-day course teaching people how to recognize the signs and symptoms of mental illness and what to do in a crisis, very similar to what we learn in regular first aid. So I go out and I teach that in the community, and I also go into high schools, colleges, and universities and elementary schools, and I bring people with me who have lived experience. And when I say that, I mean people who have may have an illness themselves, or they may have a loved one with a mental illness, and they share their personal story with the students. And this is an incredible program. I'm so honored to be a part of it, because I'm definitely not the star of the show. The individuals who come and share their personal stories with me are, and they're amazing. So we have 5 offices: Toronto, Hamilton, Halton, Peel, Peterborough, and Ottawa. And Toronto is my provincial office, so I do spend some time there as well. So I want to talk to you a little bit about mental health today. Who here has a brain? Good? Good. I didn't see a lot of hands go up, so I'm a little nervous. But all right. So, and I always ask kids that. Kids always, I didn't ask if it was working. I just asked if you had one. All right. And the real reason I want to talk to you about mental health is because mental health is about having a balance in life, right? And we all need to figure out for ourselves what that balance is. And we need to maintain this and start recognizing it at a young age, because mental health is part of our lives from when we're young to when we're old, okay? And it's not something that is static. It changes over time. It can change day to day. It can change month to month, and definitely year to year, okay? So what is your balance in life when you are, say, 16 years old is very different to what is making your balance in life when you're 30 or 45 or 60 or 75 or 80. It's all different, but it's all the same in a way. Because what you're trying to do when you talk about mental health is you're trying to balance all the things that we do in life. So family, friends, health, jobs, extracurricular activities, and all those things that go along. It's about having a balance. And we talk about that a lot, that work-life balance. But it's more than that. It's having a balance in your work and in your personal life. It's not just about having work-life balance, okay? And it's really important. Who here has ever sat on an exercise ball or been in a gym on a balance beam or anything like that? Okay. So what happens if you move just a little? Yeah, fall off. Tell me that doesn't happen every day of your life, because that's your brain and that's mental health. There are days you may wake up and be having a fabulous day. Then something happens around 2 o'clock and your day just goes downhill from there. Right? Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you spilled coffee all over you first thing in the morning, or, dumped your cereal, or anything like that. So that's all about having a balance. So that's why mental health is so important. We talk about physical health all the time, right? But we don't talk about mental health and what it is. So the challenge is to figure out, how do we stay mentally healthy? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that as we go along. So mental illness is a general term that refers to a group of illnesses and disorders that affect how somebody thinks, how they act, how they feel, how they perceive things, and how they behave, okay? So it's a very general term. So the stat is that 1 in 5, approaching 1 in 3 people will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. That's a pretty phenomenal statistic to me, all right? So that means that if not now, at some point in your life, you will know somebody who has a mental illness, and it's quite common, okay? And I guarantee that everybody here at one point in their life will deal with a mental health problem. So what is a mental health problem and what is a mental illness, and how do we figure out the difference? So a mental health problem is something like fear or anxiety or nervousness. I'll tell you one of my mental health problems is I'm afraid of heights, really afraid of heights, particularly bridges. I don't like seeing them in a movie, I don't like standing on them, and I particularly do not like driving over them. Guess what I said my territory for my job is? Yeah. Guess what I get to do almost every day? Drive over a bridge. So that's my mental health problem. I have to figure out almost on a daily basis how to get over that bridge. All right? So why isn't that a mental illness? It could be, and it could become that. If it started to interfere with my daily life, if I stopped going to work because I was afraid I might have to cross a bridge that day, if I stop doing things that I like to do with my teenagers, if it starts to interfere, if I stop going to wineries that I really like to go to, because that bridge in St. Catharines is the worst that there ever was. It looks like you disappear in the middle of the sky. It's awful. But if I stop doing those things, if it started to interfere with my daily life, that's when we go from having a mental health problem to an illness. Most mental illnesses are not diagnosed through MRIs or CAT scans or PET scans or blood work. They're diagnosed by what we experience and the symptoms that we have. And that's why it's so important to learn how to talk about mental illness. And that's why we're starting at such a young age, is because we really want people to understand that mental illness isn't something to be ashamed of. It's an actual chemical imbalance that's occurring in somebody's brain. So that's why we want to talk about mental illness, is that it's an actual chemical imbalance that's occurring in somebody's brain. It's not something somebody did to cause it. You know, it's not something that happened to them. It's not bad behavior. All right? It's really important to recognize that. But we do know that when we talk about mental illness, there's this stigma that surrounds it. There's this negative stereotype about mental illness, that there's something wrong with people, or that they're violent or dangerous. And we actually know that's actually incorrect. That 99% of people with mental illness will never, ever become violent. But it's interesting to me that those are the people that we hear about on a regular basis. Think of the words you hear used to describe somebody with a mental illness. Things like crazy, nuts, schizo, or psycho, or insane. That's the language we've been taught to use. But when we talk about somebody who's surviving cancer, we use words like hero, and survivor, and warrior, and brave, and lucky. For me, I don't understand why there's a difference. Because it's why we treat an illness in the body different than we do treat an illness in the brain. You guys have all heard the term schizophrenic, right? Have you ever heard the term cancerific? Probably not, because I made it up. And the reason I did was we don't refer to somebody with cancer by their illness. So why should we refer to somebody who has an illness in their brain by their illness? It's not who they are. It does not define them. It is something they have. Like if somebody has diabetes, it is not who they are, it is something they have. It is a part of their life they have to deal with. And that's a really important piece to me that I think we need to remember. So how do we understand mental illness then? Average age of onset for mental illness is 14 to 24. And 80% of most mental illnesses usually appear by that time. But that doesn't mean that when you're 25 you can do a little happy dance and go, woohoo, I'm never going to get a mental illness. It doesn't work that way. Things like anxiety and depression can happen at any age. 16% of the population deal with depression, 9% with anxiety, 3% with psychosis, and 1% with schizophrenia. Those are pretty high numbers. You know, when you think about those in terms of actual numbers, in Hamilton alone we have 5,400 people who have schizophrenia. 5,400. So it's not as rare as you think it is. Serious mental illness often includes things like psychosis. And we know psychosis can happen to with Alzheimer's. And I want to talk a little bit about that and why there's a difference, okay? But it also can happen with things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and even severe depression or borderline personality disorder, okay? So psychosis doesn't have to be completely and utterly rare either. There's also such a thing as drug-induced psychosis. But with drug-induced psychosis, what happens is if somebody stops using the drug that is causing the psychosis, when it leaves their body, so do the symptoms of psychosis, all right? So that's the key point there. So symptoms of psychosis often include things like confused thoughts. People often tell me that when they were experiencing psychosis, they felt like their brain was speeded up or slowed right down, like everything was kind of moving in slow motion, like in a movie. Feel preoccupied with unusual ideas or thought patterns, and believe that people can manipulate their thoughts or are broadcasting their thoughts to others, okay? These are common symptoms. They perceive voices or visions that they are hearing. These are hallucinations. Hallucinations can actually affect all 5 senses. So people who are experiencing psychosis can feel things that aren't there, hear things that aren't there, smell things that aren't there, taste things that aren't there, and see things that aren't there. But the 2 most common are seeing and hearing, okay? Those are the 2 you will hear most commonly about. And it's interesting to me that everybody I've spoken to who's experienced psychosis has said they felt different. They didn't feel like themselves, but they couldn't describe it at the time they were experiencing psychosis. The other thing to remember is that when somebody experiences psychosis, it is not a constant state. All right, so somebody is not psychotic. They are experiencing psychosis, and it's not 24/7. And people, when you're talking to somebody and you're working with somebody or you're caring about somebody who has psychosis, they will remember how they are treated. And that's a really important thing, because psychosis is actually when somebody's having a break with reality, but they still understand who they are and what is happening to them to a certain extent. And how you treat an individual is really important. So, do seniors develop a mental illness? I know this is a little bit small print, but I'll talk about it. Anxiety used to be thought that anxiety actually decreased with age. We know that's not true now. We used to believe that as you got older, you didn't get anxious anymore or nervous or upset. Go figure. But what was happening was people were concentrating more on the physical problems that somebody was experiencing and not talking about the mental health problems that somebody was experiencing. So people stopped talking about anxiety and depression, so they thought it wasn't happening in seniors. But we know that's actually not true. Anxiety affects the population at the same rate with seniors as it does with the rest of the population. And we used to believe that depression was just a natural part of aging. Well, it's not. All right? It's not something that you have to expect as you get older. It's something that does happen to some people, but it's not something that is just, oh, I'm older, so I should feel depressed. No, it doesn't work that way. We know that 5 to 10% of seniors experience depression, and that's the norm across, the age groups. But that number increases to 30 to 40% for those in long-term care homes or hospitals. That's a pretty huge leap, right? And a lot of that, and we'll talk about why that might happen. 80% of seniors respond well to treatment, but 90% of seniors with depression never actually ask for help. And to me, that's sad, right? Is because they don't feel comfortable enough reaching out, because like I said, there used to be a huge stigma around mental illness. We never used to talk about it like we do now. Cripes, when I was in school, you never would have seen a Save the Boobies t-shirt. You see those now. You never would have seen a billboard for prostate cancer or testicular cancer. And my dad had prostate cancer, and I remember being able to talk to him about it. And they were pretty sure that his father had prostate cancer, but it certainly wasn't something they were ever going to have a conversation about, let alone mental illness or mental health. It was something to be ashamed of. It was something we didn't talk about because we thought there was something wrong with the person. Well, there is. There's a chemical imbalance that's occurring in their brain that they don't have control over, and that's really important. So in terms of schizophrenia, most schizophrenia develops between the ages of 15 and 24. But there is such a thing as late onset schizophrenia, and lucky us, it affects more women than men, usually around menopause. Something else to look forward to. And then there's very, very late onset schizophrenia, which usually happens in the geriatric years, over 60, okay? We don't have a lot of data about that, but we only know that it affects about 10 to 23% after age 40. So how do people, caregivers and loved ones, how do you tell if it's schizophrenia or psychosis that's associated with Alzheimer's disease? So there's a couple of ways, all right? Is that when somebody has Alzheimer's disease, they often have visual hallucinations over auditory. And those visual hallucinations usually center around somebody they knew at some point in time in their life. And they're not as bizarre as somebody who has visual hallucinations with schizophrenia. So often when somebody has schizophrenia, their hallucinations and their delusions are often centered around things like history, religion, or sex. Okay, those are the three primary areas. But when somebody is experiencing with Alzheimer's, it's usually somebody they know, or somebody from their past, or somebody from their childhood. Okay, the delusions with schizophrenia are much more bizarre. We often hear about witches, a strong religiosity, or even that somebody's married to the prime minister and things like that. But also with psychosis with Alzheimer's, what also happens is a misidentification of caregivers. And that doesn't usually happen with schizophrenia, okay? If somebody's experiencing psychosis with schizophrenia or bipolar, often they're very aware of who their caregivers are, and there isn't a misrepresentation there. Past history of psychosis is usually very rare in Alzheimer's, those who are experiencing it with Alzheimer's, but with schizophrenia, it's been going on for a few years. Whether or not the individual recognized it or not is the key. So recommended treatment options, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is that staying on an antipsychotic is usually actually very brief with Alzheimer's, but with something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder can be much longer and much more long-term. And actually, schizophrenia, we now know, does not worsen over time. We used to believe that, it sort of had a death sentence attached to it and that people would only get sicker. We know that doesn't happen, but we know that unfortunately psychosis with Alzheimer's will worsen over time, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit too about some strategies that go along with that. So some of the challenges that rise from helping somebody who may be a senior is social isolation. Okay, so one of the signs and symptoms of mental illness is when people start to withdraw. And they withdraw from friends and family and doing the things that they love to do. That's a real sign, okay? And when we talk about signs and symptoms, there's a difference. So symptom is what somebody experiences themselves. And sign, I always like to think of it like a stop sign, is what other people see. So if you start to see that somebody you care about isn't doing the things that they normally would enjoy doing. And I always, reference this as, not everybody enjoys gardening. But maybe somebody really does, and they stop doing that. They don't want to go outside anymore. They don't want to look after things anymore. And it's got something more to do with than having physically not being able to it. There's something else happening, okay? So it's that withdrawn isolation. And then what happens sometimes with seniors is they go into a long-term care home and they're isolated even more, right? So that increases their risk and it becomes a real challenge, all right? Functional decline. So some things we know happen with age, all right? Sometimes our memory goes and sometimes our hearing or our eyesight. So these can be complications that can make things like psychosis that much worse. So when we're talking about psychosis and hearing things that aren't there and seeing things that aren't there, imagine that coupled with something like cataracts, all right? Or hearing loss, right? So it can be very, very difficult to manage. Elder abuse. We know that trauma and stress play a huge part in our lives, right? And this can actually make symptoms of mental illness that much worse. There's also something like family caregiver stress and burnout. This can be very, very difficult if you've been caring for a loved one for a long period of time, especially if we found that with elderly people and seniors, they may have gone undiagnosed for a very long period of time. One, because of the stigma, and two, because they've never shared that information that they were experiencing any of these things. So a lot of times we associated it with a physical ailment, and it actually is a mental health issue that's going on. So that's really important. And families can become exhausted, okay? Because there's also a component that goes with mental illness, and it's called anosognosia. And anosognosia is just a great big word that means lack of insight. And 40% of people with mental illness actually suffer from anosognosia, which means they don't recognize that they're ill. So it's the brain. The brain is a remarkable thing. It fascinates me every single day. But think of your brain like a GPS. How many people have typed an address into a GPS but ended up in the wrong spot? Yep. Your brain works the same way. Your brain is an electrical unit. And so when somebody has mental illness, sometimes what happens is information goes into the brain, just like it goes into yours, or just like it goes into yours. But when somebody has a mental illness or a chemical imbalance that's occurring in their brain, the information gets rerouted. So the outcome is completely different for that individual who's experiencing it. Just like in your GPS, you typed the right address in, you just didn't end up where you were supposed to be. So sometimes the brain works that way. And it's amazing what the brain will do when it's trying to protect itself. So often, and they found anosognosia in stroke patients actually. That's how they figured this out, is that they were working with people who had had a stroke and had had impairment on one of their sides. And a therapist would say to them, okay, I want you to raise your right arm. And they would say, okay, I'm raising my right arm, because their brain was telling them that they were, but physically it wasn't working anymore. So that's anosognosia, when your brain can't identify what is truly happening in other areas of the body. So that can be very complicated for caregivers and loved ones when their family member does not even recognize that they're ill or that something is going on. Okay, and that's really important to recognize that family members need support too. It's amazing to me that we have respite services for so many things in this world, but not for mental illness. We don't have respite services for people who need a break sometimes and need some help. We do have support groups. We are getting to that point where we're recognizing that the importance of caregivers and family members, because they play such a huge role. But we're not quite there yet, but we are getting there. But we need to recognize that support for somebody who is supporting somebody who may be going through something is essential. All right? So often when we get into our senior years, our life situation is changing. Maybe we don't live at home anymore. Maybe we're not living on our own. Maybe we're now living with our children or other family members. Maybe we're in a long-term care home or a hospital. Think about that, on a good day. And nobody likes change, right? And those are significant changes. So you can think how that would affect somebody's mental health, right? Financial insecurity, that changes over time. And often, we talked about this, the delayed treatment. So, we talk about the fact that most mental illnesses start between the ages of 15 to 24, but if you're now in your 50s or 60s or 70s and you've never been diagnosed, that complicates things a little bit. So there's a lot of things going on when we talk about mental health in the senior years. So, one of the things that we want people as caregivers and staff members and family members to recognize is that schizophrenia and all mental illnesses, I don't care if it's depression, I don't care if it's anxiety, I don't care if it's bipolar disorder, all mental illnesses are treatable. Every single one of them. And recovery is possible at any age. And I want you to know that too, okay? But recovery means something different for everybody. And that's why getting to know the person who's experiencing mental illness is really important. And knowing that person and what their symptoms are, what their triggers are, and what makes them feel better. How many times, and I'm sure everybody here has done this, had a family or member or a friend or a colleague or somebody we know who had cancer, right? We automatically say, what can I do to help you? Can I drive you to the doctor? Can I bring you some food? Do you want to go to the movies? Do you want me to just sit with you and we'll watch some TV? Do you want me to read to you? The number of things that we can come up with to help somebody when they're sick is amazing. But how often do we offer those same things up when we find out that somebody we care about has depression or anxiety? And sometimes it's just as easy to ask, what can I do for you today? I can't take it away. I can't take your depression away. I can't take your anxiety away. but I certainly can do what I can to help you today and at this moment. And it's asking those questions and understanding from the individual what makes them feel better. I mean, I don't think anybody likes to be told that, okay, the only way you're going to feel better is if you go lay down in a quiet room. Well, maybe that doesn't make me feel better, right? Maybe that makes me more anxious. What's wrong with asking somebody what makes them feel better when they're stressed out? Or what makes them feel better when they feel like everything's spinning out of control? Talking to people, asking those questions is really, really important. Helping people navigate the system. I work in the system, and it's confusing. It is not the simplest system in the world to navigate. So any support you can give to somebody who may be struggling, I don't care what their age is, to say, you know what, maybe I can help you. Maybe we can start with your family doctor. Maybe we can go from there. Or maybe I can look some stuff up for you on the internet. Maybe I can, or I know somebody who might have that information for you. You know, helping somebody navigate a system that is very complex is really, really important. And we can all do that, whether we're a caregiver, whether we're a staff person, or whether we're a family member. Now, this one to me is the most important thing ever, is involving the patient in decision making. How important is this? So, if somebody has a mental illness and there's something going on, their brain feels like it's spinning out of control. So who doesn't want some control back in their life, right? That doesn't mean that everybody always makes the best decisions, but why not include the individual in that decision-making process? Find out, again, what helps them, where they would be comfortable going to for support. Instead of saying, okay, we're going to go see this doctor, and this doctor, and you're just going to do what you're told. Nobody likes that, right? We like to be involved in that process, in what happens to us. And so sometimes, you know, you may say, you know what, we've got a few options here. Which one do you like best? Or if somebody says, you know what, I don't know what would make me feel better. Well, why not throw some options out there for the individual, but still let them make that final decision? Because you know as well as anybody that if you're craving ice cream, potato chips aren't going to do. Right? So there's nothing wrong with involving that person in that decision-making process. Now, as staff working in a long-term care home or anywhere in this profession, including family members in the process is really important. Family members are a huge resource to you. And yes, often we get bound by confidentiality, but you don't have to share information all the time with a family member, but you can certainly learn from a family member and gain as much information about the individual you're trying to support as you can. Things like, you know, so when this happened at home, what did you guys do? What helped? What didn't help? You know, those kinds of things. Involving family members in the caregiving process is really, really important. And advocating for the patient. If you see somebody who's struggling, there is nothing wrong with trying to get that person some outside support. If you work in a long-term care home, it is okay to access outside supports. A lot of people who work in long-term care homes or other agencies feel like they can only use the supports in their building. That's not true. There's outside supports you can access, and it's okay to do so. You're not going to get your hand slapped. That's what they're there for. Okay? We have a lot of resources in our community, and I'm going to talk about them in a couple minutes. And it's important to recognize that it's okay to access them for anybody we care about. So some of these are just very simple support strategies. You have some do's and don'ts down there too. But changing the environment that somebody lives in is much easier than changing the person. All right? So if somebody's not comfortable with the way their room is set up, what's wrong in changing it up a bit? Right? If something is making somebody uncomfortable, why not do what you can to remove that? You can't change the person. They are who they are. So let's help with the environment. Okay? But those things are really important. So let's say, for example, and we know that there's parameters though. So let's say somebody says to you, you know what? I think I need to fall asleep with 50 candles around me every night. All right, that's probably not the safest option in the world, right? But why don't we go over to the dollar store and I'll buy you a few of those that are battery operated and stay on all night for you. It's about thinking outside of the box sometimes instead of automatically saying, no, I can't do that for you. But maybe we can try something else. So, and it's really about effective communication. One of the keys to effective communication is listening. And we all think that we are really good listeners. And I got to admit, this is one skill that took me a long time to learn, is to listen to somebody without judgment and without opinion. That's hard. All right? It's really hard because our nature, human nature, is to offer up solutions and to fix things. And especially if we're caregivers, that's what we want to do. And we're in this profession because we care about people or we have family members. We want to make things better for them. But sometimes it's not about making things better, but just listening to what's going on at the time. And it's amazing the difference in a relationship, that just that listening and responding without judgment and just with support can mean the world to somebody. And it's important to often, when you're talking to somebody, there's nothing wrong with repeating something or writing it down if somebody finds it easier. We all learn in different ways, right? I'm much more of a doer when I'm trying to learn something. I need to be doing it at the same time. A lot of people are visual learners, though, and need to read something at the same time. So finding out those ways in which will help somebody. I very much, though, need lists, or I forget everything that I'm supposed to be doing in a day. And if I don't have those lists, I feel kind of lost. So it's working with what works for the individual and communicating in that way. If it means leaving a list every morning or creating a list every night, okay. If it means just sitting and listening and talking to somebody and going over it a couple of times so it'll stick in somebody's brain. That's the way my husband is. He repeats things over and over and over again so it sticks in his brain. Trust me, and then it stays there forever. But we're all different. Accommodating physical and cognitive disabilities or impairments is really important, and recognizing that this can happen as we age. Again, it's not something to be ashamed of, but we can work with those parameters. And preparing somebody for change. I don't do well with change. My 15-year-old son certainly does not do well with change. So I have to prepare him in a certain way, right? So there's nothing wrong with doing that. If you know something's coming up and you have to change something, what's wrong with saying, okay, this is what's going to happen today. I'm sorry I can't come see you because A, B, and C is happening, but I'll do my best to get there tomorrow. The other thing you want to make sure you never do to somebody is don't promise something you can't deliver. If you say, don't worry, I'm there for you 24/7. I hate that because nobody's there 24/7. That's impossible. You can't be, or you won't exist either. And especially if you're in the profession, you can always say, you know what? If you're going on holidays, what's wrong with telling the people that you're working with, I'm going to be on holidays for 2 weeks, and this is who's going to be filling in for me. Just that preparation, those simple just recognizing things for people and understanding that that's really important. And keeping a routine is really important too. A lot of people really value that. So we talked about having a brain, so we talked about having stress, right? So who here experiences stress? If you don't, come see me later because I need to know how you don't do that. Everybody does. And I always say and it's amazing to me because when I'm in schools, the one thing kids tell me all the time is that adults always say to them, you're a kid, what do you have to be stressed about? So I always tell them that whoever told you that is wrong. We always have had things to be stressed about. When we were younger, it was just different. It's not any worse than what I stress about. What my kids stress about isn't any worse or better. What my parents stressed about wasn't any worse or better than what I did. It was just different. It all affects us, though, in different ways. So what can we do about it? We can't stop stress from coming. So one of the things that I always recommend to people is building what I call a shield of support. And your shield is going to look different than your shield. And your shield will look different than yours. And yours will look different than mine. Because we all like to do different things. So one of the things is, having fun and finding those things that make us happy and that work for us. Remember when I said I had to get over a bridge? I have to find ways to get over a bridge. My son is not my support strategy when I have to go over a bridge. He likes to tell me, look how high we are, Mom. I wonder what happens if the bridge falls. I think I'm going to become a bridge engineer, and then you have to come see every piece of work that I do. All right, not working for me. So for me, though, music. Music gets me over that bridge, or a distraction, right? Somebody who can keep me talking if I'm not alone. But music, and I need it loud. in order to get over that bridge, but I can do that, right? But that's me. Storing positive memories. I do this with my kids all the time when they're having a bad day. Think about a time in your life that was completely and utterly awesome. I don't care if it was 50 years ago. I don't care if it was 2 minutes ago. Think about that and hold on to it. One of the things I always tell people, when things start spinning out of control, remember the little things. For me, when I'm having a bad day, the one thing I do want is my son, because he is the funniest thing on the planet. He drives his sisters crazy. He drives me crazy. But he's hilarious, even when he's probably getting in trouble. He uses humor. But it works. And it's one of those things, it's one of those little things that when I'm having a bad day, I sit there and think about something he's done. Okay? So it's those really small, tiny moments in time that are positive. Talk to someone. If you're having a bad day, how many times do we walk through our lives in a day and say, hey, how are you? But we don't stop to hear the answer. We need to really actually pay attention to that answer. And in this age of social media and technology, and you text somebody and you say, how's it going? And somebody says, okay, or fine. That word fine. If you're a woman, you know what that word really means. But we don't like to share. And we need to do that. We need to call upon and build that shield of support with those people around us who we can trust. And who we can talk to and say, you know what, today is not my day. Getting lots of rest, easier said than done. Exercise. Exercise is probably the most underused treatment for anxiety and depression ever. And exercise is different for everybody. If you want to tell me to go for a jog, okay, my stress level just went up about 300%. But I like boot camp because it's structured, it's in, it's out, I'm done. But everybody is different. Some people love going for walks. Some people like playing a sport. Everybody is different, but even a little bit of exercise, 10 minutes of exercise a day, it actually changes our chemicals in our brain. And it actually starts to make you feel better. You know what else does? Hugging. Hugging and physical contact actually produces endorphins that make us feel better. So when your grandchild or somebody says, no, I'm not hugging you, say, oh yeah, you are, because it's going to make me feel better. Right? Have fun, spoil yourself, treat yourself with those things. And I don't mean this doesn't have to be expensive. This can be, I need an hour to sit and read my book. Or I need, an hour to go out and play in my garden. Or I need an hour to go watch the funniest thing on television. Or whatever it is for you. And this is about you taking control over what makes you happy. Laughter. It's important. All right? It is probably one of the most healing things. It takes way more muscles to frown than it does to smile. All right? And again, laughter actually produces endorphins that make us feel better. So finding those things and those people that make us laugh. For some people, there's journals. Some people like to journal when they're stressed and write out what's going on so that they can figure out what happens when they feel bad and what makes them feel better. And I think this is really important, is setting achievable goals. Because often I know when my brain starts spinning out of control, I'm thinking about everything that I should be doing between now and 3 months from now. Instead of, what am I supposed to be doing today? And even shortening that up. What am I supposed to be doing in the next hour that I truly need to get done? Right? But there are days when you feel like everything's spinning out of control. And when we start to kind of narrow that down and set achievable goals, it's important. I remember not that long ago. So I have a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 13-year-old. Yay, lucky me, right? Actually, they're great kids. But my 17-year-old, one day, I walked into her room, and it was a complete and utter disaster. Not that it isn't on a regular basis, but this was over the top. So there was stuff everywhere. And I looked at her, and I said, what's wrong? She goes, everything. I went, everything? Really? She goes, yes, everything. And I said to her, okay, so we were going to the cottage, and I said, so you're trying to figure out what to wear up at the cottage? She looked at me, she went, no. And I said, okay, then it's not everything. So I said, let's start and figure out what it is then. It took us a while, but we weeded out that it was actually English. That her English teacher was stressing her out. So it wasn't everything. And it took a while to get there, but it's setting those achievable goals and not trying to be overwhelmed with everything in life. Because stress is one of those things, it doesn't throw you one stress ball at a time, right? It's everything all at once, and we have to learn those skills, and we have to be able to say no, and I need time for me. All right? And that's important. I don't care how old you are. It's really, really important. So we talked about local resources. These are really important. So these are things that anybody can access here in Hamilton. COAST is our Crisis Outreach and Support Team. It's a 24/7 available crisis number. You can call it. They can come out to you, okay? But remember, it's crisis, so it's not emergency, all right? So crisis is if you think something is developing and you need some assistance, all right? And the other thing is, they may not have a team available to come to you at that moment, but they certainly can talk to you over the phone. And they certainly will let you know if a team is available soon, all right? INTAC is a central referral agency here in Hamilton. And what it is instead of everybody going around trying to figure out what agency they should be working with, they go through a central referral process and then get referred out. Okay, and this is for mental health issues. So they might get referred out to Canadian Mental Health Association, or they might go get referred out to Wellington Psychiatric Outreach Patient Program, or they might get referred out to Public Health Outreach Program, Psychiatric Outreach. So there's 4 different programs that they're involved with, but they do the referral and they sort it out for you. So you're not trying to figure out where do I go, okay? And they can do an assessment. And so anybody can call. You don't need a doctor's referral to call them, but you do need to have a family doctor, okay? But it doesn't mean you have to have the doctor call in. Family members can call in. You can call in and say, I'd like to make an appointment. Barrett Center, another huge resource and great alternative to hospital. All right, we often think when somebody's in a mental health crisis that they need hospitalization. Not everybody does. Barrett Center is a great alternative. It's a short-term stay. It's run by Good Shepherd. And it's short-term stay. So anybody who stays there is 5 days or less. They have a male section and a female section, and it is in a beautiful old home. And it's fantastic. So the Barrett Center, you can call that number. They have 24/7 support as well. So if they don't have a spot available for somebody, they can offer phone support or may set up a meeting to meet with that person until a spot becomes available. And that's the other great alternative to the emergency room. However, if it is an emergency, there's another option. You can call 911, obviously, but you can ask for a CIT trained officer. So CIT stands for Crisis Intervention Trained Officers. And I, along with staff from COAST, we go out and we train police officers in Hamilton, Brantford, Haldimand, Norfolk, and Niagara. And we train them in how to de-escalate in a mental health crisis situation. So, at the SSO, we also have a 1-800 number, and this is available 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and it's an Ask the Expert. So you can call and get a counselor immediately, and you can ask a question. Any type of question. Doesn't have to be about schizophrenia or psychosis. We get lots of different questions. You can call or you can email us at that address. And again, it can be any type of question, and it's available on Monday to Friday. But I want to thank you guys. That was a lot of information in a very short period of time. If you ever have a question or you just want to stop in and say hi or shoot me an email, please feel free to do so. Thank you very, very much.